and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, weekly, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, where we compare and contrast our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And it is that time of the month, Gareth, where we come together and we talk about influencers. And in the world today, as we record this, so you'll learn more of our secrets of us recording this a little bit ahead, we're just about to go into a US election.
Yep.
That's tomorrow. You can probably do the maths and figure out when we're recording this. Lots of people influencing other people. It was so interesting to see that I don't think I've seen as many celebrity endorsements over the last few weeks. And so clearly there's this sense that these people are also now able to influence an election. So just a reminder for us that influencers, whether they are actors and actresses, political leaders, generals, we've had generals saying what they think about some of the candidates. Influencers are important. So on this particular day, Gareth, who, or I don't know what the plural of who is. I suppose it's who.
It is who.
It is who. There you go. Hippopotamuses. Who are we going to be talking about today in this episode?
Well, I'll tell you in a minute, but before we do, I just want to say I read an article this week titled "Will Taylor Swift Swing This Election?" And I was like, do you know what? We're ahead of the curve because we talked about this a good few months ago. And the broad sentiment of the article was, I think, kind of what we said, which is, no, it's not the decisive swing, but she has a hell of a lot of weight with a certain demographic, and celebrities are now political players in a way that they've never been before. So,
well, I mean, with Beyonce, Taylor Swift, Robert De Niro standing up, talking about
the guy, I can't remember his name, but the rapper from Puerto Rico who's switched sides.
Bunny.
Something like that.
Jive Bunny?
Let's go with that.
Sorry, Mr. Bunny, I would like to apologise when you listen to this in future years, because our podcast is famous and well regarded. I'd like to apologise for mispronouncing your name. No, I think that's absolutely true. And again, the principle of, I mean, this election obviously is an example of this, but it matters what kind of a leader you are.
Yeah.
I think this, if we don't know what the outcome will be, but if Mr. Trump were to lose, you have to believe that some of his leadership skills or his personality traits will have had an impact. Of course, though, just as interestingly, if he is to win, it would argue that sometimes those traits don't matter, or at least aren't the deciding factor. So we'll see.
Well,
anyway,
it might not be the deciding factor, but they sure are going to matter over the next 4 years.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So let's get back to this. We are going back in time, but still staying on that American theme. So we are doing, as you've already alluded to, two people, which is the second time we've done two people in the influencers, the last one being Paddy Mayne and David Sterling. But this time we're going to do Gene Kranz and Jim Lovell. Do you know who they are?
I do. So I'm going to see how close I get, but I cheated. I've listened to 13 Minutes to the Moon, I think it is, which is a BBC podcast by Kevin Fong, which, again, we seem to keep doing this. We recommend other people's podcasts. Once you've downloaded ours, please do go and download that. So Gene Kranz, I believe, was the head of mission control for the Apollo landings, and Jim Lovell was one of the astronauts, but also supported in a number of ways the landings and the Apollo program as well.
Yeah. So Gene Kranz, I think there were more than one mission controller, but was famously the mission controller for Apollo 13. And Jim Lovell was the mission commander on board Apollo 13.
And I seem to think Kranz was also critical in terms of forming the concept of mission control and how they operated as well.
Yeah, so we can get into that. There is a concept, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to do these two together, is Kranz, as a result of an earlier tragedy and an earlier accident on the Apollo program, Apollo 1, we'll talk about that in a moment, came up with what became known as the Kranz Dictum. He gave a speech after Apollo 1 and after the tragic loss of 3 NASA astronauts, talking about how they need to change their behaviors, change their culture, change their approach to command. And that became known as the Kranz Dictum. And what I find really interesting is how Jim Lovell, as the mission commander on board the Apollo spacecraft, that, as our listeners will already know, Apollo 13 suffered a severe failure that could have been catastrophic, and for various and at several points in the mission seemed very likely ended in the loss of the entire crew. He was the mission commander on board the spacecraft, and Gene Kranz was, as you said, the mission control, and both of them together, their leadership, their decision making, their resilience, their focus, along with a whole load of other people. And I think we will need to keep reminding our listeners that this was a team effort, but they led the teams, and they led the teams in very different ways because the context required a very different style, but it worked, and it worked together, and came, thankfully, with the result of getting all 3 crew members of Apollo 13 back to Earth safely several days after that initial accident.
Do you think that there's anything unusual in terms of the leadership skills exhibited as part of the moon landings and this kind of activity? And what I mean is, if you think about it, for some reason, for me, it feels like some of the purest forms of leadership where there is high jeopardy. There are a group of people who have not spent an enormous amount of time together. There is untested technology. There is risk. There is danger. I don't know whether this is unusual that it's sort of this setup, or whether in fact there's this risk that we make out that it was a one-off, but in fact you could take these 2 people and they could be successful in any situation.
So I'm particularly interested in this incident because I think it draws out why certain traits, behaviours, ideals of leadership work. That's not to say you need this high stakes, high pressure, and ultimately dangerous situation in order for those leadership traits to work. I think it just highlights it well. Interestingly, this is 1970, and it's a government agency, and because of what it is, spaceflight, a lot of them are former Air Force employees. There's a lot of former military employees working for NASA.
Although, interestingly, the members of mission control themselves, the people who work for Gene Kranz, I think I'm right in thinking, weren't necessarily from the military.
Well, so they're quite young.
This was the point I was
They're
getting
not
at.
necessarily World War II veterans. A lot of them had former military service. And I think that possibly is to do with it's easier to leave the military and work for another government organisation. I don't know. It's the same kind of culture. It's the same high risk activity.
The reason why I brought that up is, again, this is, and we've pretty much run out of knowledge I have in this area, which is, I think the average age of the people in mission control who did the dramatic shouting go at every point was 21 or 22. And if you think about that today, that seems unusual that you would give people who are, in inverted commas, inexperienced that position.
Yeah.
That creates interesting dynamic. That said, I was watching not that long ago Starship, and with the Starship booster, they caught on chopsticks.
Yeah.
And you looked at the mission control there, and again, it was a very young group of people.
Interesting.
I would imagine that, well, I mean, there's the sort of the Elon Musk factor, the novelty factor, the new skills. I would imagine that brings enormous opportunities of people thinking in novel ways as opposed to doing what they did last time.
Yeah.
Challenges about inexperience and challenges, frankly, of leading young people as well. So I wonder whether there was a whole host of things which are very relevant today.
So I'm now outside of the edge of my research and knowledge on this, but I wonder if NASA in 1970, moving from the Gemini program to the Apollo program, heart of the space race, trying to put people on the moon for the first time, this is wildly new stuff. And we've talked about it in the BHAG and 3HAG episode. I wonder if NASA in 1970 is an emulation of SpaceX in 2024, and if NASA in 2024 is the old and bold who think they know it all, who've done it before, who are relying on experience, and that's why they aren't as good at managing risk. I think there's probably a whole PhD thesis in that. It's beyond the discussion here, but interesting that the innovative, pushing the boundaries, new frontiers, younger people doing it. Going back to the point about military service, even if the people in mission control haven't served, a lot of them had. A lot of them were former Air Force pilots, engineers, technicians. A lot of them were also straight out of university scientists. Almost certainly the majority of them, their fathers, uncles, elder brothers, would have served in the Second World War and in the post-war mobilizations. And so they would have at least had perhaps a closer relationship with military decision making than perhaps generations now, except for those of us that have volunteered and have served. I don't know. It's interesting. Both Gene Kranz and Jim Lovell were former fighter pilots. Natural for, at that stage of space exploration, for astronauts to come from fighter pilot backgrounds. Almost all of them did on the Apollo program. It wasn't until the space shuttle program of the 1980s, 1990s that actually we started to see more school teachers, scientists.
Isn't it interesting though that nobody knew what it would take to go to the moon, and so therefore who are the people who seem to push the envelope more than anyone else? Fighter pilots.
Yeah,
and I think I remember watching The Right Stuff, where that was a very similar thing, where many of the tests they did have no bearing to going to the moon, but they were about how much can we put these people under pressure so they don't break.
Yeah. I think there is something analogous about flying a space rocket and flying a fast jet, particularly in the earlier days of manned rocketry. So in the Gemini program, where the objective was getting people into orbit, not getting to the moon, a lot of the effort is about realigning things that are moving very, very fast and doing very fast maths in your head to make sure trajectories are accurate enough. And that is a skill that fighter pilots have in spades, because I think I've said before, warfare in the air, in terms of the complexity of the environment, is relatively simple. It's three-dimensional, but there's not a lot in it. There's weather, aircraft, and birds, and that's about it. But all of those things are heading towards each other at various different angles, at varying different speeds. And when you put radars and missiles into that equation, the decision making becomes about who can make speed, distance, time equations in their head faster than somebody else. And early days of flight, a lot of that was mental arithmetic, not aided by computers and radars. So I think there was a natural progression, but I also think the general skills of staying calm when things are going wrong very, very quickly, and you have to make decisions very, very quickly, are transferable. Putting yourselves in situations where the physiological effects of the environment are completely alien to what normally we would expect is something that pilots are good at, and they have a natural physiological resilience to high G forces or vibration or whatever. So I think there are, things that mean that these people are perhaps well suited to it. I think now, where far more of the effort is about what do you do once you're in orbit or beyond orbit, there's a lot more about science, there's a lot more about psychology, especially if we're going to do long endurance missions to other planets. I think that, bringing it back to this, Jim Lovell's leadership throughout the mission, prior to the mission, during the incident where the oxygen tank explodes, and then the subsequent 72 or whatever it was hours afterward, where they were trying to work out what was happening and how to get them back, directly ties to that calmness under pressure, that ability to make critical decisions quickly without panicking, without allowing your fear to overtake and your system one thinking to overtake, and doing that whilst reassuring the rest of the team, most of which aren't with you, that the situation is under control. And there's a really interesting dynamic that I think we should probably explore, which is the leadership of teams remotely. So I think there's a sort of assumption that Gene Kranz is the leader of the team on the ground in the mission control at Kennedy Space Center, and that Jim Lovell is the leader of the three men in the Apollo spacecraft. But they equally, I think, had a leadership effect on the teams that were in the other locations, as well as the millions of people watching around the world, the families of everybody involved, the political aspects of it. So there's a much broader leadership aspect to this mission than just how do we get three warm bodies back.
Well, we should talk about that a bit in terms of, I mentioned to my wife that we were going to be talking about these guys, and she was a little bit, well, why are you going to talk about them? How are they influencers? And I think we can talk about it in two ways. From the first perspective, as you've been describing, the pure leadership and what they did. But the second thing is these guys were absolute rock stars. These were things where everyone knew their names. And to your point, that the space program, even though by, I think, Apollo 13, things were slowing a little bit, most of these were broadcast live to the world. And so to some degree, their behavior was hugely public and people were following them. So their ability to influence the rest of the world was huge at that time, perhaps in a way we don't see today. So we don't know the astronauts that go into space because it's considered every day now. But at that time, everybody knew who they were.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right. Clearly, after Apollo 11, the goal of landing on the moon has been achieved.
It became a bit.
But this is only 2 missions later.
Yeah.
So we've only done it twice, and this is about to be the third time. This is still something where people tune in all over the world to watch and witness. And I'll be honest, this is 1970. We're 54 years later, and I am still blown away by the concept of putting people on the moon. And I'm genuinely very excited that it's going to happen again in my lifetime. And I will be glued to my TV screen, even though it's happened before. This is phenomenal stuff. Add to that the fact that there's been an incident, and now everybody's wondering how we're going to get them back. Think about the Ocean Gate disaster earlier this year. The several days from they've gone missing to confirmation that the vessel had imploded, there was an awful lot of media interest in trying to find whether the crew was still alive. We knew they were alive, and it was about how are we going to get them back, or are we going to get them back?
Well, we keep talking about Apollo 13 and as if everybody knows what Apollo 13 is. Do you want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what actually happened on Apollo 13 to give context for why we're calling out that rather than the moon landing, Apollo 11?
Yeah. So the Apollo mission involved the Saturn V space rocket, multi-stage, the largest rocket ever built at the time, Now it's been built, beaten by the Artemis and the SpaceX Super Heavy, I think. But at the time, the largest rocket, all to get this tiny bit at the very top of the rocket that is the lunar module, and then the command capsule. So the lunar module's that cone-shaped bit at the very top, and then the command capsule is the little bit underneath it, and the lander, which is the weird looking gold with legs spidery thing that lands.
Nice description.
Yeah, all to get that to the moon. And the rest of the rocket is simply to get out of the atmosphere and out of the gravitational pull of the Earth. And it's mostly fuel. So the rocket launches, all of the stages break away, and they get out of the atmosphere and out of the immediate pull of gravity and out of the orbit, and they're on their way. Now it's a case of effectively drifting at high speed with very little fuel, just tiny spurts of thrust to kind of keep it on the right trajectory to go all the way to the moon. And this is what I find fascinating. Up until the point of the first Apollo missions, we'd got people into orbit. The Russians, the Soviets had beaten us to do that with Yuri Gagarin and putting the Sputnik satellite up, and we're much further ahead. But when you compare getting into orbit with getting to the moon, it's like if you hold a tennis ball up, getting into orbit is just beyond the furry fuzz of the tennis ball. Getting to the moon and back is like getting to the other side of a very large room and back. So we got to the outer edge of the furry bit of the tennis ball. 55 hours into the mission, to stop the liquid oxygen tanks that are providing both the fuel but also the oxygen for the crew to survive, to stop them freezing, they have to be mixed. And something happened where a mechanical part had broken, and at the point where they turned the mixer on, there was an electrical spark inside the liquid oxygen tank that ignited the tank.
And so the tank was on the outside of the spacecraft.
Outside of the command module, and it ruptured that tank and then also created a lot of damage to the structural integrity of the command module and other bits of equipment. What was effectively happening then was they were losing fuel. In fact, at the time of the explosion, no one knew what had happened. There was that immortal line, "Houston, we have a problem." They'd heard the explosion, the crew on board. Obviously, everybody in Mission Command hadn't. There was no sort of live audio. So until Jim Lovell jumped on the radio and said, "Houston, we have a problem," that was the first ground control had heard of it. They were then looking through the radio signals they get from the data analytics of the systems to work out what was happening. And at that time, there was confusion. And no one really knew exactly what had happened.
They're conflicting.
There was lots of conflicting
data.
information, yeah. And there were certain people with certain bits of data who were saying one thing, and certain people with other bits of data, because they were all in their own sort of buckets, looking at their individual data feeds, saying different things, saying conflicting things. And actually, some of the people in Mission Command were actually saying, this can't be, this can't have happened, and were denying reality because they hadn't conceived of this problem happening, and they thought it was a data error. They thought this is a system bug, even though clearly Jim Lovell and the team on board were saying, no, we've heard a loud explosion, we felt a loud explosion, and actually we were looking out of the window, one of the windows of the command module, and seeing particles of liquid oxygen spraying out into outer space. This is where I think Gene Kranz shows the brilliance of his style. And this is where Jim Lovell, I think, shows the brilliance of his style. So Jim Lovell, very calm, on board, voice procedure over the radio, reacting to what's happened, very calm, very decisive, very clear about what he's doing, exactly what buttons he's pressing to isolate valves and limit the amount of fuel that is being lost and shutting down electrical systems, and very, very clear about what he's doing. Because even at that stage, he recognizes that the people on the ground are going to need to know not only what has happened, but also what state the command module and they're in post this explosion based on what they've done. And part of that is reassuring to the other two crew members and reassuring to the people on the ground. Gene Kranz takes full responsibility. He's on the floor plate of mission control and very, very quickly recognizes that there is conflicting information and says, stop, we need to work out what has happened. So what are the things that we know? What are the things that we suspect? And what are our confidence levels in the things that we suspect? And that is really interesting because those are exactly the three things that as an intelligence officer in the military, you need to provide to your commander. What do you know? What do you now think about what's going to happen? What is happening? So what are you guessing, estimating, and assessing? And what are your confidence levels? And it's okay to say, we know this, I think this, but you know what? That is a wet finger in the air guess because I don't have the data to be able to give you confidence. And that's fine because you are just being honest about the situation you're in. What you can't do is be certain about things that you're not. And what you can't do is refuse to make those assessments because that helps nobody. He very quickly then breaks down the teams into smaller teams to work out their bits of the problem and to look at things like how much fuel have they lost and what does that mean in terms of continuing with the mission or getting the teams back. There's another group of people.
Power, isn't it? One of the things they have to do is how much power they
How
have
much
left.
electrical power have they got? So this whole thing is run off batteries, effectively, banks of what I imagine are larger than car batteries, but batteries. And that powers things like the fuel supply, keeping the fuel from freezing,
Heating.
the heating on board to stop them freezing to death, the oxygen supply to keep the astronauts alive, the electrical systems to maintain PNT, so precision navigation and timing, so working out where they are. And that's vitally important because the thing about going to the moon and back is it doesn't require rocket fuel and thrust. It requires sitting on a trajectory and literally allowing gravity and momentum to do the work. So he sent a team off to go and look at how much battery power we've got, another team to go and look at what the minimum amount of power is required to keep the system operating, and another team to look at the maths behind the trajectories and what is the best way of getting these people back. Is it turning around now, bursting a whole load of fuel and thrusting so they're now heading back towards Earth? Because at this point, they're closer to Earth than they are to the moon. Or is it better to just keep going towards the moon and then use the gravity of the moon to slingshot them back?
So there's a couple of things they've already done, which is really interesting, and you could get very, very wrong. The first thing is about stopping. You talked about the fact they said stop. If we carry on, we're going to make bad decisions. The second thing is about how you deal with an emergency. There's courage, particularly for Lovell and the people on board. There seems like there's lots of opportunities to get it wrong. Why don't they get it wrong? Is it because it could have been someone other than Kranz, or it could have been someone other than Lovell? It was all checklists. What was special about it that perhaps was particularly those people that made it work?
So I think we should take a break.
Oh, good.
And we'll come back
Nicely
after the
done.
break, and I will introduce the Kranz Dictum and talk about the shaping of the culture that led to the team that brought them back. And we can also then talk about the known checklist type activities and the unknown activities, the stuff that the problems they hadn't come up against before. This isn't the problem has arrived, they've had an explosion, now how do we get them back? This is the start of a lot of problems. So this explosion has created a lot more challenges for this team, some of which they're not aware of yet. This comes back to the interplay between command and leadership, decision making, information assessment, and thinking ahead about things you don't know the answers to, uncertainty, and decision making in complexity and uncertainty, and the value of applying the right approach. So we'll come back and we'll look at the Kranz Dictum, because I think that will start to answer that question.
Excellent. See you straight after the break. Welcome back. I actually know how the story ends.
Yeah.
I know what happens, and yet there's something quite special when you talk about this, that you can almost feel it, sort of this idea of an explosion has happened. They don't quite know how or why. And now it's human beings more than the machines that have to work out what to do.
Yeah.
And the slightest wrong turn means 3 dead bodies in a spaceship drifting into space.
Yeah.
So you talked about the Kranz Dictum. That sounds like that's become something that's recognized and people teach. So tell us about the Kranz Dictum.
So it starts with Apollo 1. Apollo 1 was a full pre-flight test with astronauts on board of the Saturn V spaceship, space rocket with the.
So they weren't going to take off. They're going to do everything but take off.
Everything up to the firing procedure. And something goes wrong for a whole load of reasons. The 3 crew on board burned to death in the command module, in the lunar module, strapped in, flicking all the switches, firing up, and something goes wrong. There's a fire on board. And the way that the module has been designed, they can't move fast enough. The doors are designed so that they pull inward, and the pressure that built up because of the fire means they can't open the doors. They have a very high oxygen mix in the air that they're breathing.
So more flammable.
Very much more flammable, and this is why the fire has spread so quickly inside the command module that they're in. And there's a whole load of other things that have gone wrong. Gene Kranz gave a speech which became known as the Kranz Dictum, or the sentiment of that speech became known as the Kranz Dictum. Spaceflight will never tolerate carelessness, incapacity, and neglect. Somewhere, somehow, we screwed up. It could have been in design, build, or test. Whatever it was, we should have caught it. We were too gung-ho about the schedule, and we locked out all of the problems we saw each day in our work. Every element of the program was in trouble, and so were we. The simulators were not working, mission control was behind in virtually every area, and the flight and test procedures changed daily. Nothing we did had any shelf life. None of us stood up and said, "Damn it, stop." I don't know what Thompson's committee will find as the cause, but I know what I find. We are the cause. We were not ready. We did not do our job. We were rolling the dice and hoping that things would come together by launch day, when in our hearts we knew it would take a miracle. We were pushing the schedule and betting that the Cape would slip before we did. From this day forward, flight control will be known by 2 words: tough and competent. Tough means We are forever accountable for what we do and what we fail to do. We will never again compromise our responsibilities. Every time we walk into mission control, we will know what we stand for. Competent means we will never take anything for granted. We will never be found short in our knowledge and in our skills. Mission control will be perfect. When you leave this meeting today, you will go to your office and the first thing you will do is write down tough and competent on your blackboards. It will never be erased. Each day when you enter the room, these words will remind you of the price paid by Grissom, White, and Chaffee. These words are the price of admission to the ranks of mission control.
That is an amazing speech. And if we finished the episode now, I think that stands. We've almost had the conversation, which is accountability, leadership, vision, mission. You can imagine why a group of people would go back to their offices and write that on their whiteboard.
Yeah.
That it encapsulates an approach to leadership without having to tell people what they have to do, but just that approach and the seriousness. And I think one of the things we talk about so much is leadership starts at the top.
Yeah.
And that uncompromisingly sets the standard for what is expected of the team and for how the teams set each other's standard. Outside of that, though, is, I think, another lesson, which it sounds like he learned as well, which is you don't understand, we're in a hurry. And
Yeah.
I find that, we talk about team, task, and individual. And all too often, I hear that the task is the most important thing. And all too often, even you forget what the task is, because it is the idea of the task is the most important thing.
Yeah.
Where what he's saying is we were too bold. Bold is the wrong word, but we were too
gung-ho.
We gung-ho. We were willing to cut corners. We were willing to hope. We were willing to assume it would work out.
And hope is not a strategy.
And I mean, the fact that it took the death of 3 of their friends and colleagues, but I think that's literally that. If you wanted to teach leadership, you could read that speech out and say, just go look at what that means, and it will tell you so much.
Yeah.
It must have been an incredible thing to do, because again, you've touched on it, but the context here is it's not just we want to get to the moon and this is, the plan says we'll do that next year. This was a nation fighting for its survival against what was considered an enemy. So going to space was not just today an entertaining exploration. It was, we have to beat the Russians.
Yeah.
Now, we look back and think, what do you mean you had to beat the Russians? We know that there was nothing catastrophic at the end of this, but at the time it was, if we allow them to beat us, this is part of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And so the ability to say, we would be more successful by slowing down and doing it right. That in itself, I can imagine there were people saying, you're a traitor.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've not done any research into people's reactions at the point where Kranz sort of makes his speech. But what I find, my favourite bit of this is the sentence where he says, I don't know what Tompkins committee will find as the cause, but I know what I find. We are the cause. There's an accountability to that, but there's also there was an opportunity. I'm guessing Kranz didn't need to give this speech at all, but there was an opportunity there to say, Thompson's doing the investigation. I'm not going to comment until we find out, the results of I don't want to prejudice that. And how many times do we hear that from people who are supposed to be our leaders? How many times have we heard that in the last 5, 6, 7 years? For every government scandal, there's an investigation. I don't want to prejudice it. I'm not going to comment. Rather than there is an investigation. I don't know what they're going to find.
But let me tell you what I stand for.
There are these problems and we're going to solve them. Or, I don't know whether this was a technical failure or a moral failure, but let me be very clear. We're going to change the way that we do things. And I think, he's not blaming anybody. He's not saying this was the fault
Well,
of
he said
the engineering
it was
department.
collective
This is
responsibility.
collective responsibility.
There's something in there as well, which there was clearly a trajectory for how NASA behaved
Yeah.
and their approach to safety, particularly. One of the hardest things I've found in an organization is to change the fundamental trajectory of the organization. It is very hard. There is inertia to keep doing the thing you're doing
Yeah.
or make small modifications. I wonder whether this statement was also, I suspect, if it's true unconsciously, an attempt to make that change.
Well,
When everyone previously, I could imagine everyone saying, come on, we have to hit the target. Come on, we have to go. This is the ability not just to change, but to say, we are not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
Everyone stop,
take
a deep breath, recalibrate, and think about this new way of thinking about the problem.
I think the fact that he says the first thing you will do is to go and write tough and competent on your blackboard, that is an action-oriented approach to change. Here is a very simple thing you do. Gene Kranz isn't for a minute thinking that by writing tough and competent on a blackboard, somehow he's solved the problem.
He's physically triggered change.
But he's physically triggered change in that now people are going to see that and they can react to it in two ways. They can either look at it and go, we're not doing that, and that might trigger some feelings of guilt or some feelings of shame. Or you go in and it reaffirms that's why we're here. But either way, doing that every day, seeing that on the blackboard, it's a very simplistic thing, but it's action-oriented change.
There's another thing which I think it's important. I'm really enjoying this because I think even though, I don't know much about Gene Kranz, you can actually extract a huge amount very quickly. Here's another thing about that. His power of communication.
Yeah.
And now, clearly, that was the business he was in, communicating, being a head of mission control. But the power of communication, he could have quite easily not made that speech. He could have written up a memo, and he could have sent the memo around saying, everyone, we should really think about safety. And I want you to go back and write competent and all this kind of stuff. And it wouldn't have had the same effect. I can imagine him standing up and speaking to people, looking them in the eye. That would have actually disproportionately had an impact on people.
Yeah.
The ability for a leader to stand in front of their people, say these things, which is very different from the same words but in a memo, or the same words said to one or two people and then interpreted. So that's another element of that leadership, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. And so before the break, you asked how the team was ready to face the challenge. And I said, this is just the start of the challenge. I think that dictum, that action-centered change orientation to a never fail. And we talk about a never fail culture. What Kranz isn't saying is we're too good to fail. What Kranz is saying is we're going to work as hard as we possibly can to make sure that we're ready to face what we need to face. So there was an awful lot of extra process steps that Kranz brought in that slowed the project down, but we're exploring the what ifs. That's what I've described before as red teaming, but asking the question of, yeah, absolutely, that is the next step in the process. We flick that switch, we do that, the oxygen level drops, and then we do this. But what happens if it doesn't? And then people go, well, what do you mean? Well, then something's broken. Right, well, what's broken? Well, we don't know. It could be a whole load of things. Well, let's list the things it could be. Go away, come back and tell me in half an hour what all the things that could have broken are that would mean that when you flick that switch, it doesn't happen. And so what they ended up doing is checklists, and you've already mentioned checklists, became tree diagrams. And so a checklist went through and it was, we flick the switch and this should happen. If this doesn't happen, turn to this page. If this happens, turn to this page. Now do these checks to find. And so there was a diagnostic process that didn't exist beforehand. There was also a whole load of rehearsals for these problems and challenges. And what it meant was that when the explosion happened, when people were starting to receive all this anomalous data that they weren't expecting. Some of them had certainly experienced this before. They'd experienced, to a lesser degree, of course, because it wasn't for real, but the stress of, oh my God, I'm being tested because something's gone wrong and I've got to work out what it is. Some of them had planned out diagnostic tests based on the results that they actually saw, which meant they got to the answers quicker. But then the things that they weren't sure of, the things that they hadn't tested before, the things that were absolutely new to them, they at least had a concept,
They had a framework by which they could work through
from
things.
which they could work through. And this is where things started to go wrong. And I think we spent a lot of time thinking about Gene Kranz and the influence he's had on the team. But let's switch our focus to Jim Lovell in the command module. The command module is starting to, they turn the heating off to save power.
It's starting to die.
It's starting to get very, very cold. They now have far less information to work with because they've shut a lot of the systems down, and they're starting to feel tired. They're emotionally stressed, clearly, and they've been awake for hours. And Jim Lovell is managing a team of 3 in very close proximity, one of which is also starting to go down with a fever because he's got an infection. I think he's got a urinary tract infection that hadn't been picked up on the pre-screening medical. So he's starting to be quite ill, and actually by the time he lands, he is seriously ill and needs to be flown to hospital almost immediately. Jim Lovell is having to manage the physical team far more so than Gene Kranz on the ground. But interestingly, both of them make the call at the right time to step back and say, I need a break. So Gene Kranz isn't the mission control commander for the entire recovery because it's for 3 or 4 days. So he needs to sleep. He needs to take time out to recover and recuperate. And so he hands over. And he's very careful about when he hands over. We've talked about this before. Jim Lovell doesn't have that luxury. Jim Lovell is in the spacecraft for the whole time. Those 3 astronauts are just going to have to grit it out. But there is still an ability to take it in shifts and take some sleep. There is still an ability to delegate jobs. And Jim Lovell gives particular people on the spacecraft jobs to do to keep them occupied. He's very careful about what those are. So the guy's feeling ill, he gives them quite simple jobs that are going to be quite time consuming just to keep him occupied. He gives them all jobs to make sure that they all feel like they are contributing rather than just hanging around in space waiting for somebody on the ground to solve the problem. During this process, the power is running out. Somebody on the ground makes the decision that they could use the lunar module, which has a separate power supply, separate battery pack, as a lifeboat. So they can shut down the entirety of the command module because it's dying, it's running out of fuel, it's running out of power, and they're going to need that oxygen, fuel, and power for re-entry. So they can use the lunar module, which isn't going to do its primary job of,
landing on the moon.
And so they get into that, and then they start to increase carbon dioxide. And the reason is that part of the systems they've shut down, or part of the systems that were damaged, I can't remember exactly, the CO2 scrubber is no longer working. And this, for those of you that have seen the Apollo 13 movie, where Ed Harris plays Gene Kranz and Tom Hanks plays Jim Lovell, this is the bit where they realise that they've got a solution, they've got another scrubber,
but the wrong shape.
But it's the wrong shape, and it's literally square peg round hole problem. And this is where on the ground they have to come up with a solution. And they know what the problem is. Now they've got to come up with a solution, but they've got to come up with a solution within a very specific time frame because these people are going to die if they don't.
Well, also they can't show them the solution.
And they can't show them
the solution. If you've ever tried that game where someone tells you how to do a thing
Yeah,
but can't show it to you, that's incredibly difficult.
absolutely. And so they know roughly what's on board the aircraft, and the team on board the aircraft explain to them what they've got exactly. So we've got, a roll of duct tape, we've got a spare spacesuit or
By the way, can
whatever.
I just say, I love the fact they took a roll of duct tape to space because it's the
Yeah,
world's most useful
absolutely. Yeah.
piece of equipment.
Yeah, and they literally start with what have they got? They've got medical kits, they've got food packets, they've got rolls of duct tape, they've got spare electrical wire, they've got fuses. They lay it all out, and a team of people, their job is to come up with not only a workable solution, but a workable solution that can be done by tired, cold, lethargic people over 100,000 miles away in a tiny, cramped, dark, and now full of moisture space, when the only way, as you said, that it can be explained to them is by voice over a radio. And so they do this, and they sort of test out the solution, and they write it out into step-by-step processes. And I think it's something silly, but it becomes something like 4,000 steps, because they have to go down to the level of take a piece of tape that is 5 inches long. Now put it on your right hand side. Now take a bandage from the first aid kit that is this size and fold it in this particular way, and each fold becomes a step. I can't remember, and I don't actually know the exact details of exactly how they did this thing, but they create a converter that is workable. Throughout this process, there are several other things going wrong. So they're losing more power than they thought they were going to lose. So they have to go through another diagnostic process of working out why, and then what systems they can now shut down. And they're now at the point where they've already said we are at the irreducible minimum, and now they're saying, well, you've got to get us more power. We've got to save more power, so you've got to save us, you know,
12 amps or whatever.
yeah, 12 amp hours or whatever. And they're like, oh, right, well, this is the irreducible minimum, so what can we take risk on? And all the way through this process, and the third member of the crew, I can't remember which one it was, but it is getting worse and worse with this fever. Jim Lovell maintains absolute optimism throughout. So his voice, all the way through, and these voice recordings are all available. You can find them on the internet. The radio communication between the ground control, all of it is available. And all the way through, you can tell he's tired, you can tell he's stressed, but there is optimism in the language that he used, in the pitch that he used, all the way through. The idea that this might not work never comes through. And I have no idea what he was thinking, but certainly to the person on the other end of that radio, to the people sitting behind him listening, there is a reassurance. There is a continual focus on the mission at hand, which is what can we do to get us home? How can we help get us home? And it's things like eating a meal, having some sleep. This is part of the process that is going
Well,
to
it's
get us home.
leading by example again as well.
Yeah,
It's a classic thing. A leader says, well, I don't need to sleep because I have to show that I have to be the one that takes the hardest hit.
yeah,
The smartest leader that says, oh, I'm going to make terrible decisions if I don't sleep. So everyone, I'm going to take some sleep now and you take your turn.
yeah, absolutely. And then the final aspect of all of this, I think, is the dealing of the immediate families. So there are three families of the astronauts on board the spacecraft. And then, of course, there are the families of everybody in Mission Command and the wider NASA mission and support crew of the entirety of the mission. And clearly, the three families of the astronauts on board are the priority here. But the way that they are managed and thought about and comforted and informed is really well thought out. Gene Kranz and Jim Lovell are both instrumental in making sure that they get the balance right between keeping them informed, keeping them hopeful, keeping them aware of the mental state and the physical state of the astronauts on board, keeping them aware of the new challenges and problems that are emerging, keeping them aware of the solutions to those challenges, but without dragging them into the crisis, is phenomenal. And for Gene Kranz to, particularly because he's the one who takes the time to go and talk to the families, to bring them into mission control at the right times, but to keep them in, you know, a separate room to make sure that they're not overhearing some of the more difficult conversations between some of the engineers about what is or isn't necessary to keep the guys alive, and to keep the detail away, but the sort of general sense that they know what is happening, whilst also managing all of these other challenges and issues and the disparate teams. I think, you know, that particularly struck me and resonated with me as a another sign of excellent leadership, because I think it would have been very simple to see that as a distraction and somebody else's job, and he absolutely took that on board.
It's interesting, as you were talking about this, it wasn't that many episodes ago we did our Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
And I did wonder if you think about Lovell and Krantz, we went through the traits of an ideal leader. I haven't prepared this, so I don't know how this is going to go. We talked about vision, strategic thinking, tactical genius, charisma, and influence. The vision for what we're going to, the Kranz Dictum.
Yeah.
Strategic thinking about how you will actually go about do it. Tactical genius in terms of how you drive and build a team, and then how you react to an emergency.
And break the team down into sub teams, break the problem down, know who your people are, where the expertise lies. He recognised early on when the conflicting information comes in, he recognised when to say, stop, are we going down the wrong path here? Are we now convincing ourselves of something we think has happened rather than exploring what could have happened? And if he hadn't done that, they would have done, and they would have made the wrong decisions early that would have been irreparable in terms of wasting fuel, time, electrical power, and oxygen levels.
Charisma and influence. The speech,
yeah,
but also how he communicates on level on the spacecraft. Innovation. I think by definition, having never sent people to the moon before, but also creating a scrubber. The ability to build teams. Integrity. Do the right thing.
Yeah.
Empathy, emotional intelligence, as you've talked about, looking after people. Resilience, courage, collaboration, and crisis management. Quite interesting. I don't know that we've necessarily found someone who seems, maybe it's because we're focused on him for the last hour or so, or those two, actually they seem to really tick those boxes.
Yeah, and I think certainly together they tick those boxes. There's a subtlety in, as we said in the Frankenstein's Monsters episode, actually, context is important.
Mm-hmm.
If Gene Kranz had been on board as the mission commander on the command module of Apollo 13,
swapped around.
If Jim Lovell had been the mission control, would it have been so successful? I don't know. It's an amazing thought experiment. I think Jim Lovell was perhaps a better tactical leader who had a better sense of how to manage individual small team emotions, manage the crisis in a situation where they are reliant and dependent on an external larger organization to solve a lot of their problems and challenges. I think Gene Kranz was a far more operational leader and strategic thinker who had changed the culture in ahead of the problem, had worked hard to build the right team to be able to solve these kind of problems, and then managed a very large, disparate and diverse team to solve the problems as they arose, anticipating and making sure that they're not shutting down options before it's too late.
I think we've come to the end of our hour, but it makes me want to go away and both watch Apollo 13, but also I talked about 13 Minutes to the Moon, which was this podcast
It's an
about
excellent podcast.
excellent, but they actually also do the Apollo 11 as well, which is amazing. You'll actually hear them talking about you can hear the radio, and you can actually, they interview many of the people there. So please do go do that. Interestingly, two influencers, which if you talk about today, perhaps people don't know their names anymore. But the fact that there is a dictum named after Kranz, that's a good start.
Well,
really, really good ones this
Jim
week.
Kranz was mission commander in 1970 for Apollo 13. He retired as a senior leadership advisor and consultant to NASA command program in 1994.
Really, in 94?
Yeah, so he obviously had some value and they kept him on.
Good. Thank you for that, Gareth. I knew some of that, but not all of that. And actually, you brought that alive. But it was so nice to sort of take the story and dive a little bit deeper. We hope you enjoyed that. That was a slightly different set of influencers. We learned less about how terrible they were at military college, which seems to be most of our influencers. But actually, it was good to really deep dive and focus on the sort of the Apollo 13 world and the
Yeah, I mean, we've pretty much
story.
focused on a 4 or 5 day event, and apart from the Kranz Dictum that changed the culture leading up to it, we spent an hour literally talking about the decision processes.
I suspect
over 5
there's
days.
a lot more as well. So
Yeah.
if we've got anyone listening who is a real expert, or even dare I say it, nerd, please do let us know. We are on X, Battling with Biz. We are at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com if you use the email thing. If you have not already subscribed, please do go do so. And even more importantly, we're loving the fact that we're getting more and more new listeners every week. Please share with your friends. If this is an interesting conversation, you think it's valuable, we'd love for them to join us and hear. And of course, for those of you listening to this perhaps for the first time, we have a whole host of influencers. We very much enjoyed recently doing the Frankenstein's Leader episodes, but there's nearly 100 episodes. We have to count when we get to episode 100.
We are very close.
We'll have to work out what we're going to do special for that. But for now, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Battling with Business.
Thanks very much. Cheerio.